Imagine a courtroom where the defendant is silent, eerily, profoundly silent, but not because he's exercising his right to remain silent. No, this defendant is dead, quite literally. It's January 897 CE, in Rome. Pope Stephen VI, whose track record with political stability is about as sturdy as a medieval wooden bridge in a storm, has decided that the best way to resolve a papal grudge is to dig up his predecessor, Pope Formosus. Yes, exhume him. Formosus is dressed in full papal regalia, seated upright on a throne, and placed before an ecclesiastical court to answer charges of perjury, illegal papal ambition, and, most scandalously, bishop hopping. Imagine Judge Judy, but the contestant hasn't blinked in 9 months. The charge sheet reads like a bitter resignation letter from beyond the grave. The defense is handled by a deacon who, by all accounts, is talking to himself. He nodded. Chroniclers say, though in fairness, it might just have been decay. And why not? This is the 9th century papacy, where resurrection is apparently less innovative than posthumous litigation. It's a place where the living and the dead both play politics, and where the dead occasionally lose. Over the next 2 hours, we'll journey through one of the strangest episodes in church history, the Cadaver Synod, a tale of exhumation, absurd theatre, political vengeance, and the relentless bureaucracy of the afterlife, at least, the papal version of it. Because if history teaches us anything, it's that sometimes the best way to win an argument is to wait until your opponent can't talk back. Under the pale winter light, the gates of St. Peter's Basilica creaked open to admit a small procession. Not a grand public ceremony, this was a quieter movement, cloaked in clerical authority, shadowed by political necessity. The air was cold enough that every breath seemed to hang, reluctant to disperse. Some in the group carried candles, their flames bending in the breeze, illuminating faces that appeared intent on not meeting each other's gaze. At the center was the task, an exhumation ordered by the Pope himself. The tomb of Pope Formosus lay in the basilica's sanctified earth, a place of rest that had not yet known its finality. Stone was pried open, layer by layer, with the muffled scrape of tools echoing in the cavernous space. The basilica smelled faintly of incense from the morning offices, but now it mingled with the colder scent of turned earth. Every sound seemed amplified. The dull clink of chisels, the shifting of weight on marble floors, the low murmur of clerics speaking in Latin half-phrases. The work was deliberate, as if speed might betray the gravity, or the absurdity, of the act. When the sarcophagus was uncovered, the men moved as though they were both thieves and priests, custodians and violators. Formosus was drawn upward from his resting place, his remains carefully lifted under the watch of vested officials. Whatever physical reality the body presented was obscured beneath layers of ceremonial fabric. Here, presentation mattered more than truth. The robes were not merely retrieved. They were restored to their full papal splendor, each piece adjusted as though the man inside might be summoned to walk again. A crozier was placed in his hand, a gesture both symbolic and strangely theatrical. Witnesses described the scene without flourish, but their plain words carry an odd weight centuries later. They record the corpse being seated upright, its form arranged with as much symmetry as the situation allowed. This was no hurried preparation, it was staging. The papal tiara, once the mark of supreme spiritual authority, now crowned a silent defendant. Buttons and clasps were fastened with the same care given to living pontiffs before a mass. The choice of vestments was deliberate, the full regalia of the Bishop of Rome, as if to remind everyone what was on trial. Not merely the man, but the office, its continuity, its legitimacy. Gold-threaded fabrics caught in the dim candlelight, glinting as though defying the somber nature of the errand. An altar server adjusted the folds, ensuring the garment draped properly over the throne on which the body would soon sit. The care in the arrangement suggested reverence, yet the purpose betrayed it entirely. The entourage moved from the burial site toward the Lateran Basilica, the seat of the Pope's judicial authority. The streets between were not thronged with the curious. This was not an event for the public stage. Yet, hoofbeats and the shuffle of sandaled feet accompanied the slow progress. A few market vendors paused, their expressions unreadable, as the strange cortege passed under the January sky. The city had seen papal processions before, but rarely one where the pontiff at the centre required no escort of dignity, only balance. At the Lateran, preparations had been made in advance. A wooden throne was set at the front of the hall, flanked by ecclesiastical officials in their own vestments. The throne itself was unremarkable, save for the fact that its occupant would not rise to greet anyone. Candles ringed the dais, their light falling unevenly across the space, casting long shadows that seemed to shift with the movement of every robe and mitre. Clerks sat ready with their writing instruments, for even this would be recorded with precision. The placement of Formosus was a studied act. His body was eased onto the throne, spine propped, head supported so that it faced forward. A gesture from one attendant adjusted the crozier. Another smoothed the edge of the pallium over his shoulders. From a distance, in the flicker of candlelight, the scene might almost have resembled a living court session if one ignored the stillness. In that stillness, the trial was already taking form. For the clergy present, the ritual exhumation was not merely a retrieval, it was the opening argument in silence. Here was a man who had crowned kings, shifted alliances, and survived political storms in life, now seated to answer for them in death. The irony was not spoken aloud. The room seemed to acknowledge it in the careful avoidance of eyes meeting. The proceedings were not yet underway, but the atmosphere was already charged, as though history itself were leaning forward to watch. Every candle flame seemed to tremble with anticipation. In the records, there is no suggestion that anyone protested this first act of the synod. Perhaps obedience outweighed conscience, or perhaps the spectacle was too compelling to interrupt. Either way, the exhumation was completed with the solemn efficiency of a liturgical rite. The transformation, from buried pontiff to robed defendant, was complete. What remained was to speak the charges aloud, to give this theatre its script. And so, the corpse of Formosus waited, draped in the symbols of his office, seated in the seat of judgment, surrounded by men who both served and condemned him. The air in the hall was still, heavy with the mingled scents of incense and cold stone. The trial could now begin, and with it, the strange unfolding of a legal drama where one side would never answer back. In the 9th century papacy, even the dead could be summoned to court, and they could lose. The Hall of Judgment was neither grand nor vast, but in that moment it felt cavernous. The vaulted ceiling seemed to press downward, its shadows elongating the figures who stood along the walls. In the centre sat Pope Formosus, or rather, what remained of him, elevated on a wooden throne like an icon that had lost its blessing. Candles burned in careful symmetry, their flickering light catching on gold thread and ivory crozier, as if the court wished to pretend the defendant's silence was a choice. The gathered clergy arranged themselves into semicircles, their eyes flitting between the body and the presiding pope. Pope Stephen VI sat nearby, his gaze fixed on the corpse with the intentness of a man rehearsing lines for a part he has already decided to win. His robes were immaculate, the white and crimson catching every shaft of light that filtered from the high windows. The contrast was deliberate, the living pontiff arrayed in authority beside the dead one clad in ceremonial obedience. Beneath the pomp, the air carried a strange tension, half solemn rite, half political theatre. A clerk shuffled parchment, waiting for the signal to begin. The charges, when read, were neither whispered nor softened for the unusual audience. Formosus was accused of perjury, of violating canon law by transferring sees without papal sanction, and of coveting the papal throne while still Bishop of Porto. Each accusation was delivered with the precision of a courtroom drama, as though the defendant might at any moment object. The list was long enough to fill several minutes, yet short enough to suggest that the verdict was already written. Silence followed, unbroken, unanswerable. A deacon stepped forward, his role as defense counsel as thankless as it was surreal. He stood beside the throne, glancing once toward the unmoving figure, then toward the court. Every word he spoke was pitched formally, citing canon law, precedent, and the possibility of misunderstanding. It was less a defense than a monologue, delivered to a jury of bishops and one exceedingly still client. Some chroniclers claimed that at certain moments the corpse's head shifted slightly, a movement explained equally by gravity and by legend. Those in attendance made no outward sign of discomfort. The trial proceeded as if both prosecution and defense were present in the usual sense. Questions were put directly to the defendant, with the deacon answering in his stead. This ritual call and response lent the scene a strange rhythm, punctuated by the scratching of quills recording every exchange. It was law conducted in the shadow of liturgy. Pope Stephen himself took the role of chief interrogator, at times leaning forward as though expecting the man before him to speak. His voice echoed under the vault, sharp in tone when reciting charges, softer when invoking ecclesiastical authority. Observers might have wondered whether the questions were meant for Formosus or for the living audience watching this unprecedented display. In either case, there was no interruption, only the occasional adjustment of a candle or cough from the gallery. Every pause felt deliberate, as though silence itself were evidence. The irony lay in the careful preservation of trial formality. Witnesses were called, each stepping forward to affirm or elaborate on the accusations. Their testimonies were framed in legal Latin, the phrases rolling like waves over the unhearing defendant. One swore to the truth of Formosus's unlawful ambitions. Another recounted his shifting political allegiances. The body remained still, an anchor amid the tide of words. At intervals, the deacon objected, politely, formally, without hope of changing the outcome. He cited passages from church councils, historical precedents, even scripture, all while addressing a court that seemed to regard him as a necessary ornament rather than a persuasive advocate. The act of defending a man beyond earthly hearing blurred the line between devotion and futility. If he faltered, it was not recorded. The chroniclers note only that he fulfilled his role. In that, perhaps, he won the only victory available to him. The longer the proceedings continued, the more the surreal nature of the event seemed to dissolve into procedure. Clerks wrote. Bishops listened. Stephen questioned. The deacon replied. No one mentioned that the defendant's hands, arranged neatly on his lap, would never raise in oath. The court treated absence of speech as absence of defense, even though the rules of engagement had been set against it. Form became the substitute for reality. By mid-session, the scene had acquired an air of inevitability. Every point made by the prosecution was met by a counterpoint from the defense, yet none appeared to shift the court's sentiment. The charge of illegal ambition was repeated with particular emphasis, as if to imprint it on both record and memory. Stephen's expression betrayed no fatigue. His resolve seemed to sharpen with every exchange. The court was performing for history, not for justice. The deacon's final statement was brief. He affirmed the service and dedication of Pope Formosus, denied the charges, and urged the court to remember the sanctity of the papal office. His voice carried across the hall, unbroken, until it met the stone walls and returned as a faint echo. No one responded. Instead, the presiding bishops turned their attention to Stephen, awaiting his summation. When the Pope rose, his shadow loomed over the throne. He spoke of order, law, and the need to cleanse the papacy of past transgressions. His words were measured, yet every sentence tightened the net already woven around the accused. Formosus, crowned and robed, sat unmoving, his silence now a canvas for every accusation. The defendant's role was complete, to bear witness to his own condemnation without interruption. The court recessed briefly. Not for deliberation, there was nothing left to decide, but to prepare the formal pronouncement. Outside, the January air was crisp, carrying the distant bells of another church at prayer. Inside, the candles still burned beside the throne, their wax beginning to pool. The audience returned to their places, eyes fixed on the Pope. The verdict was ready, and with it, the final act of this peculiar trial would begin. the court reconvened in a hush that was heavier than any sermon pause. Formosus still sat upon his throne, unchanged, as though the recess had been a momentary lapse in an otherwise unbroken vigil. Pope Stephen VI rose, holding the parchment on which the verdict had been written in careful legal Latin. The language was formal, deliberate, shaped for the permanence of record rather than the ears of the accused. The candlelight made the ink shimmer faintly, as though the judgment itself had weight enough to catch the light. The charges were restated: perjury, violation of canon law, unlawful ambition for the papal throne. Each was pronounced with the tone of inevitability, not debate. The bishops flanking Stephen nodded in solemn rhythm, their agreement a chorus of authority. No dissenting voice was recorded. None appears to have been raised. When the final line of accusation was read, Stephen announced the court's conclusion: guilty on all counts. The sentence was as symbolic as it was punitive. First came the stripping of the papal vestments, an unmaking of the office that had already been vacated by death. One by one, the garments were removed: the pallium, the chasuble, the stola, each folded away as if to deny they had ever belonged here. The crozier was taken from his hand, the tiara lifted from his head. It was a reversal of the investiture rite, performed in reverse before the same church that had once elevated him. Next came the gesture that would linger in chroniclers' accounts for centuries: the removal of the 3 fingers used for blessing. A clerk read aloud the justification that a pontiff who had been unlawfully elected could not confer lawful blessings. The act was carried out with ritual precision, as though the court were editing the very memory of his authority. The symbolism was not lost on those present. To strip a pope of his ability to bless was to unmake his papacy retroactively. It was ecclesiastical logic taken to its most literal extreme. With the vestments gone, the body was dressed in the plain garments of an ordinary cleric. The contrast was stark: the transformation from pontiff to priest, from priest to convict, and from convict to discarded relic. The throne stood empty for a moment, as attendants prepared to carry the condemned away. Stephen watched from his seat, expression unreadable, as the court's decision moved from words to execution. The deacon who had defended Formosus stood silent, his role now complete. The decrees of Formosus's papacy were declared null. Every ordination, every appointment, every judgment, undone as if they had never been made. Bishops he had consecrated now stood in a curious limbo, their own authority suddenly questioned by the very hand that had given it. In the eyes of the court, the past itself had been rewritten. It was a verdict not just against a man, but against the reality he had shaped. The final step was the disposal of the body. Stripped of office, stripped of dignity, Formosus was to be buried once more, but not in holy ground. At first, he was laid in a grave outside the basilica, away from the sanctified earth of St. Peter's. But the sentence did not end there. Stephen ordered that the remains be removed yet again. This time, the Tiber River would serve as Rome's ultimate archive. The procession to the river was without ceremony. A few attendants carried the body under a grey winter sky. The streets damp from recent rain. The city moved around them, vendors calling out prices, carts rattling over cobblestones, oblivious or indifferent to the strange justice being enacted. At the riverbank, there was no prayer, no rite, only the swift release of the condemned into the water. The Tiber closed over him with the same silence that had marked the trial. To later chroniclers, the disposal in the river symbolized a kind of purification, Rome cleansing itself of an unworthy pontiff. Others saw it as a final insult, an erasure of both man and memory. Whatever the intention, the act ensured that the Cadaver Synod ended as it had begun, with spectacle. The court had claimed victory over an opponent who could neither resist nor repent. It was Laura's theatre, performed in full view of history. Pope Stephen VI had made his point. In condemning Formosus, he had reasserted the authority of the living over the dead, the ruling faction over its rivals. Yet the verdict's reach would extend beyond the synod, unsettling the very order it sought to uphold. The bishops left the hall in measured silence, their robes whispering against the stone. Only the throne remained, empty, its occupant carried away by the current of the Tiber. And so the Cadaver Synod's opening chapter closed, not with reconciliation but with the deliberate unmaking of a pope. In the weeks to come, the consequences would ripple outward, touching allies and enemies alike. For Stephen VI, the trial was both victory and warning, an act that silenced one voice but stirred many others. The Tiber carried its burden downstream, but the story was already flowing elsewhere. Rome, in all its contradictions, was not yet finished with Pope Formosus. Under the low winter sky, the political winds in Rome carried more chill than the season alone could account for. The trial of a corpse had been the visible theatre, but beneath the stage boards ran the deeper current, the struggle for control of the papacy itself. In the late 9th century, Rome was less the seat of unified spiritual authority and more the contested prize in a protracted feud between rival noble houses and imperial claimants. The cadaver in the dock had been, in life, a skilled navigator of these shifting allegiances. That skill, while useful in turbulent times, had left him vulnerable to the resentment of those who preferred their enemies to remain predictable. Formosus's career had been marked by a capacity to survive in hostile political climates. He had held the bishopric of Porto for decades, even after being excommunicated, recalled, and exiled in turn. But survival required choices, and those choices, whether crowned with caution or ambition, left a paper trail of alliances. One such alliance had been with the Spoletan rulers of Italy, whose influence over the papacy was considerable. Another, later in his papacy, had been with their imperial rivals, the Carolingian claimant Arnulf of Carinthia. This reversal was no mere clerical reshuffle. It was a declaration of political preference on a continental scale. By crowning Arnulf as Holy Roman Emperor in 896, Formosus had publicly abandoned the cause of Lambert of Spoleto and his mother, the formidable Agiltrude. It was a choice made in the belief that Arnulf's military presence could secure Rome's stability. Instead, Arnulf's illness and sudden withdrawal from Italy left Formosus's papacy exposed. A chess piece advanced too far without support. The Spoletan faction, once sidelined, now saw their chance to return the favour. Stephen VI, elevated to the papacy in this restored Spoletan climate, owed much to their patronage. His own ecclesiastical career had been advanced during the years when the Spoletan cause held sway, and he had every incentive to demonstrate loyalty. In that light, the Cadaver Synod was less an inexplicable aberration than a calculated offering, an act of vengeance dressed in canon law. By prosecuting Formosus even in death, Stephen was delivering a political corpse to match the literal one before the court. The message was as much for the living as for the dead. The choice of charges, perjury, ambition, violation of canon law, was no accident. Each accusation corresponded to one of Formosus's controversial moves during his life. Perjury reflected earlier disputes over oaths sworn and broken during his exile. Ambition was a broad and useful category, encompassing his willingness to accept the papacy despite previous prohibitions. And the charge of holding multiple bishoprics at once, though technically accurate, carried the added sting of institutional betrayal. In the papal politics of the 9th century, the courtroom was not merely a place of judgment, it was an extension of the battlefield. The Cadaver Synod allowed Stephen and his allies to retroactively nullify Formosus's appointments, stripping power from bishops who might oppose them. It was a legislative coup conducted in the language of piety. By erasing Formosus's acts, they could weaken entire networks of influence in a single stroke. It was an efficient solution to the perennial problem of rivals who refused to stay buried, literally or politically. Yet the spectacle was not without risk. While the Spoletan court might have seen justice served, other factions regarded the trial as an unsettling precedent. If a pope could be judged posthumously, what was to stop similar charges from haunting future pontiffs? The air in Rome, already heavy with factional suspicion, thickened further. The basilica that had hosted the trial now stood as a reminder of the day when the papacy's highest seat became a defendant's bench. For the common citizens of Rome, the motives were clear enough in outline, if not in all their complexity. They saw that Formosus had crossed powerful enemies, and that those enemies now controlled the city. The rest, the legal recitations, the Latin decrees, was theatre for the benefit of the learned. But even the unlearned could sense that the trial's verdict was less about sin than about supremacy. The logic was political first, theological second. This mingling of law, ritual, and vengeance was not unique to the Cadaver Synod. Throughout the era, similar displays had marked transitions of power across Europe, from the trial of rebellious nobles to the posthumous condemnation of kings. But Rome's choice to place its dead pope on trial stood apart for its audacity. It was a statement that no office, however sacred, was beyond the reach of political correction. In that sense, the trial was both a warning and a template. In the days following the synod, Stephen's authority appeared strengthened. The Spoletan faction could point to the public humiliation of their rival as proof of their restored dominance. Yet the trial had also exposed the machinery of papal politics to uncomfortable light. What had once been whispered in the corridors of the Lateran was now paraded in the nave. The stagecraft was impressive, but it left the audience aware of the wires and pulleys. In the end, the Cadaver Synod was a power play as transparent as it was elaborate. Its legacy would rest not in the permanence of its verdict, but in the demonstration of what political necessity could demand. Formosus had been made an example of. Stephen had been made a spokesman for his faction. But Rome was a city where examples had a way of turning back upon their makers. The Tiber still carried the Pope's remains downstream, but the currents of politics were beginning to shift in ways Stephen could not control. The Cadaver Synod was not only an act of vengeance, it was an exercise in institutional self-preservation. Pope Stephen VI faced a problem that was both legal and personal. His own path to the papacy had been shaped, at least in part, by the man now seated before him in death. Formosus, during his tenure, had elevated Stephen to the bishopric of Anagni. If Formosus's ordinations could be declared invalid, then Stephen's own consecration, and thus his legitimacy as pope, would collapse like a tower built on sand. It was a paradox. To protect his position, Stephen had to dismantle the very foundation that had given it to him. The logic of nullification was as bold as it was circular. By declaring that Formosus had never been a lawful pope, Stephen could insist that all acts performed during his papacy were void. Every ordination, every episcopal appointment, every papal decree, unwritten retroactively, as though they had been inked in disappearing script. The effect was sweeping, touching clergy across the Italian peninsula and beyond. A network of churchmen found themselves in an ecclesiastical limbo, their authority questioned by a verdict delivered to a corpse. Contemporaries might have seen this less as theology and more as administrative strategy. In an age without standardized record-keeping, memory itself was a political tool. Erase the memory of a pope's acts, and you weakened the alliances he had forged. Those loyal to Formosus were left defending not only their own status but the historical fact of his papacy. It was, in essence, a battle over the past fought in the present. This strategy had precedence in secular politics. Kings and emperors had long employed posthumous condemnations to undermine rival dynasties. The papacy, however, claimed a higher moral authority, and the spectacle of a dead pope being stripped of legitimacy unsettled even some of Stephen's allies. The more thoroughly he erased Formosus, the more conspicuous the erasure became. The attempt to close the matter threatened to keep it alive. Still, the legal maneuver had its immediate uses. If Formosus's ordinations were null, Stephen could replace bishops with men loyal to his faction. The church hierarchy could be reshaped in weeks, strengthening Spoletan influence in dioceses far from Rome. It was governance by subtraction, removing the pieces placed by an enemy and filling the gaps with allies. The dead pope's trial was, in this sense, a sweeping personnel change disguised as moral correction. Yet the tactic carried personal implications Stephen could not ignore. If his own consecration as bishop was void, then his papacy rested on uncertain ground. By some accounts, Stephen's supporters argued that his position was secure because he had been reconsecrated after Formosus's death. Others saw this as a thin reed, a technical fix to a theological breach. The very act meant to secure his legitimacy hinted at its fragility. The courtroom became the crucible in which this fragile logic was tested. When Stephen pronounced the invalidation of Formosus's acts, he was also retroactively rewriting his own history. It was an extraordinary gamble, betting that the authority of the living pope would outweigh the awkward contradictions in his own claim. For the moment, it worked. The bishops in attendance affirmed the verdict without recorded dissent. But beyond the basilica walls, the reasoning was less universally accepted. For many in Rome, the nullification smacked of self-interest. The papacy, already viewed as a prize in the contests of noble families, seemed here to be altering doctrine to match the needs of the reigning faction. The sacred and the political were so tightly interwoven that the boundary between them dissolved. What appeared as theology in the courtroom was read as expedience in the streets. The Cadaver Synod became, for these observers, an emblem of how far the office could bend to serve the occupant. The irony was hard to miss. By erasing Formosus's papacy, Stephen risked erasing his own, or at least undermining the permanence of papal authority in the eyes of the faithful. A pope who could be so thoroughly undone in death might not inspire confidence in the permanence of the office itself. The very nullification that sought to protect the institution might, in time, weaken it. It was an institutional meltdown masquerading as law. The decision would not stand unchallenged. Later, popes would revisit the verdict, some quietly reversing it, others openly condemning the synod as an affront to the dignity of the church. But in the cold weeks after the trial, Stephen's ruling was the law of Rome. The cadaver's silence had been read as consent to the rewriting of history, and for the moment, that was enough. It was one thing to condemn a political rival. It was another to make the condemnation a public performance. The Cadaver Synod was staged, not behind closed doors, but in the basilica, under vaulted ceilings where sermons and coronations had taken place. The choice of venue was deliberate. The trial was as much for the audience as for the court. In an age when most politics unfolded in whispers and corridors, here was a spectacle no one could mistake for subtlety. If Stephen VI wanted Rome to see the humiliation of Formosus, he ensured they saw it in the most sacred and public space available. Theatrics had always played a role in papal politics, but rarely with such a macabre prop. A living defendant could protest or weep. A dead one could only sit there, mute and immutable, while accusations were read aloud. The silence itself became part of the theatre, the perfect foil for Stephen's oratory, the unanswerable witness to his charges. The basilica's acoustics carried each word through the nave, making every sentence sound like a proclamation to eternity. It was a courtroom where the echoes were almost as important as the verdict. Witnesses later recorded that, midway through the proceedings, an earthquake shook the city. The tremor rattled the columns and set the lamps swaying, scattering reflections across the marble floor. For some, this was a sign of divine disapproval, nature itself registering protest. For others, it was an unplanned flourish in an already dramatic performance. Either way, it only deepened the impression that the trial was unfolding on a stage where even the elements participated. The props were chosen with care. Formosus was dressed in full papal vestments, crozier in hand, tiara on head, as if to remind the audience exactly who was being brought low. Each piece of regalia carried its own symbolic weight, and each would be removed in turn as the trial progressed. It was costume design as narrative arc, the gradual unmaking of a pope in visual chapters. Even those who could not follow the Latin charges could follow the stripping of garments, like cues in a silent play. The supporting cast played their roles as well. Bishops nodded gravely at each accusation, their synchronized gestures giving the scene the rhythm of liturgy. A deacon spoke in defense of the corpse, a role so thankless that it verged on tragicomic. The audience might have seen in him a man debating with silence, delivering counter-arguments to a face fixed in death. It was not a duel of words, but of appearances, and appearances had been arranged to favour the prosecution. In its structure, the trial resembled a morality play, the medieval theatrical form that taught lessons through dramatised sin and judgment. But here, the lesson was not spiritual redemption, it was political obedience. The audience was meant to see what became of those who opposed the ruling faction, even after death. The message was impossible to miss, and perhaps impossible to forget. It was deterrence, dressed in chasubles. The earthquake aside, the absurdity was embedded in the very logic of the trial. To accuse a corpse of perjury was to pretend that the dead could answer for their oaths. To strip a dead man of blessing fingers was to suggest that his gestures still carried power from beyond the grave. In another context, such acts might have been dismissed as superstition. Here, they were presented as justice. The seriousness of the delivery was what made it all the more surreal. Stephen understood that the memory of this event would outlast the details of the charges. Rome was a city that remembered stories more vividly than statutes. A trial like this, with its strange blend of ritual and theatre, would be retold in taverns, in marketplaces, in letters to distant dioceses. The very improbability of the scene guaranteed its survival in rumour and chronicle. In this sense, the spectacle was a political investment. The strategy had an internal audience as well. Within the church hierarchy, the synod demonstrated that papal authority, at least under Stephen, could reach into the grave. It set a precedent for the extent of ecclesiastical jurisdiction, absurd though it might seem to the uninitiated. The performance was not only aimed at the people of Rome, but at bishops and abbots whose loyalty might waver. It was a reminder that the institution could be as theatrical as it was theological. And yet, theatre carries risks. A performance meant to inspire fear can also provoke ridicule, and ridicule erodes authority in ways defiance cannot. The Cadaver Synod walked that narrow edge, commanding awe from some and disbelief from others. For those inclined to mock, the trial was already a parody of itself, a courtroom where the star witness could neither speak nor hear. Such images, once fixed in the mind, are not easily erased. The absurdity did not diminish the seriousness of its consequences. Formosus's acts were annulled. His body was cast into the Tiber. The theatrical trappings might invite a smile at their strangeness, but the political effects were concrete and far-reaching. It was a spectacle that reshaped the church's hierarchy, even as it unsettled its moral image. The curtain fell, but the plot it served would continue to unfold. In the end, the Cadaver Synod was both trial and performance, law and show. Its absurdities were deliberate, its theatrics calculated. Stephen VI had turned a political purge into a visual lesson for Rome and beyond. Whether the lesson was learned as intended was another matter. The audience, as always, would decide. For now, the stage was empty, but the story was far from over. Under the dim light of an early Roman dawn, long before the Synod's theatrics, Pope Formosus had been a man of movement, not the restless shuffling of the condemned corpse in the 8th of January 97, but a cleric in constant negotiation with his own survival. His life was an itinerary written in shifting allegiances, exiles, and returns, each chapter marked by a change in the political weather. The papal throne, in his day, was less a seat of stability than a chair placed in the middle of a marketplace, vulnerable to whoever shouted the loudest. Yet in this chaos, Formosus had risen steadily, if not smoothly, through the ranks of the church. He began as the Bishop of Porto, a modest title on the edge of Rome's ecclesiastical sphere, where the Tiber's slow waters met the salt tang of the sea. From there, his reach extended far beyond Italy. He was sent as a papal legate to Bulgaria, a journey that required crossing mountains and the deeper frontiers of religious diplomacy. In those years, the church in the east eyed Rome with suspicion, and the Bulgarians, newly Christianized, weighed alliances like a merchant weighing gold. Formosus's mission was to secure Rome's influence, a task as much about tone and posture as theology. By most accounts, he succeeded, enough for the Bulgarian ruler to request him as their permanent archbishop. This request, however, carried more trouble than honor. Canon law forbade a bishop from abandoning his assigned see, and the very fact that Bulgaria wanted him so badly stirred unease in Rome. The papal court was quick to suspect that ambition, not piety, was driving his popularity abroad. Formosus was recalled, his influence clipped before it could grow beyond the city's grasp. In the papacy of the late 9th century, an excess of success was as dangerous as open dissent. The next chapters of his life read like a ledger of banishments. Under Pope John VIII, Formosus was not merely removed from office, he was excommunicated, accused of conspiring with political enemies and deserting his post. The charges blurred the line between religious and political offense, a common feature of the age's papal indictments. Rome was less interested in whether the accusations could be proved than in whether they could be used, and in this case, they were used to make him vanish from the city's stage. Yet exile was rarely permanent. With John VIII's assassination, a fate that befell more than one pontiff in that era, Formosus's fortunes reversed. A new pope, more sympathetic or perhaps more in need of skilled allies, reinstated him as Bishop of Porto. This return was quiet but telling. Survival in Rome's ecclesiastical hierarchy required not just faith but the art of reappearing at the right moment. Formosus had mastered this art, emerging again when the tides shifted in his favour. By the time he was elected pope in 891, Formosus had already navigated decades of these tides. His elevation was less the coronation of an untarnished candidate than the culmination of a long, bruised career. He entered the Lateran palace with the scars of political weathering, aware that the throne he now occupied was as precarious as ever. The office came with both authority and the constant hum of conspiracy behind its doors. In Rome, the scent of incense often mingled with the smell of plotting. As pope, his most visible acts were bound to the shifting balance between local factions and the great powers north of the Alps. At first, he crowned Lambert of Spoleto as co-emperor with his father, Guy III, a gesture of allegiance to the Spoletan party. But as Lambert's influence waned and Arnulf of Carinthia's armies edged closer, Formosus changed course. In 896, he invited Arnulf to Rome, crowned him Holy Roman Emperor, and by that act undercut the Spoletan claim. In the ledger of Roman politics, this was a bold transaction, and a costly one. The papacy of Formosus unfolded under a Europe that resembled a chessboard, with too many hands moving the pieces. Kings, dukes, and popes alike made and broke alliances in cycles so short that yesterday's enemy might be today's dinner guest. In such a setting, loyalty was often measured not in decades or years, but in seasons. Formosus had navigated this system with the instincts of a survivor, but each maneuver left another faction quietly sharpening its knives. When the knives came out after his death, they did so in the most literal and public fashion possible. Accounts of him from his lifetime are as divided as the politics he engaged in. To his allies, he was a capable and pragmatic pontiff, willing to act decisively when Rome's interests were at stake. To his enemies, he was a manipulator, a man who cloaked ambition in pastoral duty. The truth, as often in that century, was probably a blend of both, though truth mattered less than the perception that could be sold to the right audience. And in Rome, perception was a currency almost as powerful as coin. Even before the Cadaver Synod, Formosus's story carried the elements of theatre. There were entrances and exits, alliances formed and broken, sudden reversals of fortune. His election as pope was not the final act of his career, but the beginning of its most contested chapter. The stage was set for conflict long before Stephen VI ordered his exhumation. In that sense, the synod was not an isolated absurdity, but the last scene in a play that had been running for years. From the marble steps of St. Peter's to the damp corridors of exile, Formosus's life traced the precarious arc of a man caught between spiritual authority and political survival. He ruled a church that was itself a battlefield, where liturgy and intrigue coexisted without embarrassment. The decisions that brought him down were not made in the shadow of death, but in the bright and dangerous light of the papal court. And when his enemies finally staged their posthumous trial, they were, in a way, continuing the political theatre he had been part of all along. The difference was that, this time, his role in the drama was entirely silent. The 9th century was not kind to the papacy's sense of continuity. In the space of less than 100 years, the throne of Street, Peter changed hands roughly 24 times, a turnover rate more familiar to taverns than to thrones. Popes were elected, deposed, exiled, reinstated, and sometimes assassinated, with such regularity that Rome's clergy must have treated each pontificate as a provisional arrangement. A newly elected pope might reasonably unpack his vestments but keep the trunk by the door. The Vatican archives of the era read less like a line of succession than a list of temporary caretakers for a very unlucky chair. The causes of this turbulence were woven into the political map of the time. Rome was not an isolated city-state. It sat in the crossfire of competing powers. The Carolingian Empire, the Kingdom of Italy, and the powerful noble houses of central Italy. Each faction treated the papacy as both a spiritual prize and a political asset, useful for coronations, legitimizing claims, and occasionally blessing a military campaign. Popes were not merely shepherds of souls, they were referees in a game where the rules were rewritten by whoever could seize the advantage. And referees, as in any volatile contest, often found themselves caught in the brawl. The Spoletan dukes, in particular, exerted a gravitational pull on the Lateran palace. Their influence reached deep into the College of Cardinals, ensuring that elections tilted in their favour whenever possible. A pope who resisted Spoletan demands might soon find himself facing charges, exile, or worse. Yet favouring them too openly risked alienating rival factions, and those rivals had their own candidates waiting in the wings. Balancing these pressures was less like steering a ship than like standing in a small boat while others rocked it from both sides. Even the imperial crown north of the Alps was no guarantee of stability. The Holy Roman Emperors, from Charlemagne's heirs to the later Carolingians, viewed the papacy as an extension of their own authority. When imperial fortunes dipped, popes loyal to them often fell in Rome's estimation. When they rose, the same popes could suddenly be treated as indispensable allies. The papal court learned to navigate these shifts, but no amount of political seamanship could prevent sudden storms. The result was an institution that looked venerable in theory, but improvised in practice. Canon law prescribed orderly elections. Reality substituted hurried gatherings, where political survival mattered more than spiritual consensus. In some cases, the death of a pope led to competing elections. 2. Sometimes 3 claimants to the throne, each backed by their own faction and armed retainers. It was not unknown for a pope to rule only a few weeks before being replaced, creating a kind of revolving door where legitimacy was determined by who could keep it longest, not who had it first. In this climate, papal decrees could be reversed almost as quickly as they were issued. The 9th century papal palace itself mirrored this instability. Its halls, though adorned with mosaics and frescoes, were filled with the low murmur of alliances being tested and bargains struck. Messengers from distant rulers mingled with local clerics, each gauging which way the wind was blowing. One could walk past the papal apartments in the morning and hear Latin prayers, then pass again in the evening and overhear urgent, whispered negotiations about armies, coronations, and dowries. The sacred and the political were not separate rooms. They were the same space, seen from different angles. Clerical careers rose and fell alongside those of the popes they served. A bishop elevated under one pontiff might find himself stripped of office under the next, his position handed to a rival from the winning faction. Even lesser churchmen felt the ripple effects, as diocesan appointments were reassigned to secure loyalty. This constant reshuffling bred a culture of cautious allegiance. Loyalty was professed loudly, but rarely tested for long. It also bred resentment, the kind that could smoulder through multiple pontificates before igniting. The wider Roman public, though largely excluded from formal decision-making, could not help but witness the turbulence. Processions to welcome a new pope became almost routine. The same streets that hosted coronations one month might see an armed escort, leading the pontiff into exile the next. For a city accustomed to spectacle, this political theatre was a familiar genre, even if the plot changed with bewildering speed. Chroniclers of the time recorded these events with a mixture of formality and fatigue, as if they too had learned not to expect stability. In their annals, the reign of one pope bled into that of his successor like overlapping shadows. For all its instability, the 9th century papacy still wielded considerable influence. Foreign rulers sought papal blessing to bolster their claims, and even the most embattled pope could sway the balance of power with a single coronation. But this power was double-edged. To grant legitimacy to one claimant was to alienate another, and to alienate a determined rival was to invite retaliation. Thus, every decision carried both immediate consequences and long-term risks, a reality no pope could fully escape. The throne of St. Peter was less a sanctuary than a strategic position under perpetual siege. It was into this landscape that Formosus rose, fell, and rose again. His career was not an exception to the era's volatility, it was a product of it. To survive in such a climate required a careful balance of visibility and discretion, being important enough to matter, but not so indispensable as to provoke envy or fear. Many of his contemporaries failed to find that balance and vanished from the record after brief, turbulent reigns. Formosus's fate, both in life and after death, would prove how precarious even the most skillful navigation could be. If the papacy was a revolving door in the 9th century, then each turn of it created opportunities and enemies in equal measure. The instability did not merely set the stage for the Cadaver Synod, it made such a spectacle almost inevitable. In a world where the authority of a pope could be undone by the next pope's pen, why not also by his hands, even after death? The synod's surreal logic was, in a way, only an extension of the century's own restless rhythm. Formosus's trial may have been extraordinary, but the instability that led to it was entirely ordinary for his time. The late 9th century papacy unfolded on a board where the pieces were crowned, armoured, and rarely still. The rules of the game were never written down, but every player understood them. Alliances were temporary, moves were calculated in months rather than years, and the church was both a player and a prize. Formosus, by the time he reached the papal throne, knew this board well, and knew that survival required more than piety. In Rome, sanctity was admirable, but strategy was indispensable. His papacy would become a study in how quickly a winning move could become a liability. At the start of his reign, Formosus aligned with the Spoletan faction, the dominant Italian power anchored by Guy III of Spoleto and his young son Lambert. Guy had already secured his position as King of Italy, and his ambitions pointed toward the imperial crown. Formosus obliged, crowning both father and son co-emperors, a ceremonial act heavy with political weight. This public endorsement bound the papacy to Spoletan fortunes, signalling to Rome and beyond that the Lateran palace stood with Italy's native rulers. It also placed the Pope's own fate in the hands of a single family. But the Spoletans' grip was not unshakable. Guy died in 894, leaving Lambert as a teenage co-emperor under the regency of his formidable mother, Agiltrude. Their authority was contested by Arnulf of Carinthia, the East Frankish king whose armies loomed over northern Italy. Arnulf claimed the imperial title through descent from Charlemagne, and unlike Lambert, he commanded the support of powerful German nobles. To many in Rome, the choice between them was less about loyalty and more about which force could actually arrive at the city gates. Formosus's shift in allegiance came in 896, when Arnulf marched south at the Pope's invitation. The decision was practical. Lambert's position was weakening, and Arnulf's army was near enough to make its presence felt. When Arnulf entered Rome, Formosus crowned him Holy Roman Emperor in St. Peter's Basilica, the same rite he had once performed for Lambert. In the ritual language of coronations, the words were the same, but the meaning was entirely different. The act publicly nullified Spoletan supremacy and placed the papacy in Arnulf's camp. Such a reversal was not without precedent, but in the volatile atmosphere of the time, it was seen as a betrayal. Lambert and Ageltrude interpreted the coronation as a deliberate repudiation of their authority, and by extension, of the faction that had supported Formosus's election. In a political culture that valued steadfastness as much as shrewdness, the pivot to Arnulf could be, and was, framed as opportunism. The resentment it sowed did not dissipate with Formosus's death. It became the foundation for the Cadaver Synod itself. Even in the grave, the Pope was made to answer for that moment in the Basilica. Arnulf's triumph was short-lived. Soon after his coronation, he suffered a sudden illness. Some chroniclers whispered poison and withdrew north. Without his presence in Italy, Lambert and Ageltrude regained the initiative, reasserting Spoletan influence in Rome. Formosus, now isolated from his chosen protector, faced a city where his political enemies controlled both the streets and the rhetoric. It was an unsteady final year for a pontiff who had once played the factions against each other with skill. This interplay between secular and sacred crowns was not unique to Formosus's pontificate, but his case showed its risks in high relief. The papal office held the power to legitimize emperors, yet in doing so, it exposed itself to the fortunes and feuds of those same rulers. A pope who crowned the wrong candidate might find his authority questioned, his decrees challenged, and his legacy rewritten. Formosus's coronations of both Lambert and Arnulf became the perfect evidence for either loyalty or treachery, depending on who told the story. The Cadaver Synod would later use both events as ammunition. Rome itself was the ultimate prize in this chess game. Whoever controlled the city controlled access to the papal court, and by extension, the prestige of imperial coronation. Armies moved not just to conquer territory but to secure processions, blessings, and the visible imprint of legitimacy that only Rome could confer. In such a context, the Pope was less a distant spiritual figure than the pivotal piece on the board, a king in the chess sense, slow-moving, highly valuable, and worth overthrowing. Formosus, as both bishop and pope, had spent decades learning how to remain upright, while other pieces fell. Yet every move left traces. Each alliance he forged was remembered, and each reversal stored for later use. When Stephen VI, a Spoletan ally, came to power, those memories became formal charges, not in the form of whispered accusations, but as a full, posthumous trial. In that courtroom, the coronation of Arnulf would be presented not as pragmatic diplomacy but as criminal disloyalty. The chessboard of his life became the prosecution's exhibit. The Cadaver Synod was, in part, the final move in this game, a spectacle meant to overturn not just Formosus's actions, but the political gains of his reign. By declaring his papacy invalid, Stephen could nullify his own consecration by Formosus and undermine Arnulf's imperial legitimacy in one stroke. It was both legal theatre and political counterattack, rooted in the same calculations that had shaped Formosus's life. The irony was that the same strategic flexibility that had allowed him to survive for decades in Rome became, after his death, the case against him. In the 9th century papal chessboard, survival was never the same as victory. The trial ended as abruptly as it had begun. The corpse of Formosus, stripped of its vestments and mutilated, had been flung into the Tiber as though the river itself might serve as an unmarked grave. For a few days, Rome was silent, not out of agreement, but out of shock. Witnesses to the synod drifted from the basilica into narrow streets, carrying with them the image of a pope's remains seated in judgment. It was a picture difficult to forget and harder still to explain. The river, however, was less cooperative with Stephen VI's verdict than the court had been. According to later accounts, the body of Formosus washed ashore, carried by the current, as though returning to dispute the ruling. Fishermen found it, or so the stories claimed, and quietly gave it shelter. In a city where relics were venerated and even rumours of miracles drew crowds, the sight of the former pope's remains resurfacing could be read as divine intervention or divine refusal to stay buried. Stephen's government did not treat this as a sign. He continued to occupy the Lateran Palace, issuing decrees, holding audiences, and presenting himself as the unshaken successor. Yet the air in Rome was different. The spectacle of the Cadaver Synod had not cowed the public. It had unnerved them. The papacy was meant to project continuity and sacred authority, not the mechanics of vengeance. Even those who had no love for Formosus could sense that a line had been crossed, though no one could quite define where that line lay. In the months after the trial, Rome became a city of whispers. Taverns and marketplaces carried the low murmur of dissent, while in the churches, priests delivered homilies with cautious phrasing, aware that even a scriptural parable might be taken as commentary on recent events. The Spoletan faction still held power, but it was a power that now moved under a gathering cloud. The same citizens who had watched the trial without protest began to imagine its reversal. The revolt began not with an army, but with a rumour that Stephen's authority was under review not in heaven, but in the streets of his own city. Chroniclers give little detail on how the uprising was organised. In 9th century Rome, discontent could spread as quickly as incense smoke in a small chapel. What is certain is that by August of 897, the discontent had taken shape. Crowds formed, doors were barricaded, and the Lateran, once a seat of power, became a stronghold under siege. Stephen was taken prisoner before he could flee. His removal from office was not a dignified abdication but an act of containment, as if Rome itself had decided to place him on trial without ceremony. The chroniclers, usually attentive to formal proceedings, offer almost nothing about his interrogation. They move quickly to the outcome. Stephen was strangled in prison, his death recorded with the brevity reserved for an event everyone already knew. The irony was stark. Stephen had accused his predecessor of unworthiness, seeking to erase a papacy through legal theatre. Now he was erased without trial. His own reign terminated by the same forces of political reversal he had once commanded. In the ledger of papal succession, the entry for his death is as unadorned as the cell where it occurred. With Stephen gone, the city shifted as quickly as it had risen against him. The Lateran Palace, recently the stage for one of Rome's most infamous trials, reopened under new leadership. His successor, Romanus, would soon undo Stephen's rulings, but in the moment, the more urgent task was restoring the appearance of order. Processions resumed, bells rang at the appointed hours, and the machinery of the papacy turned once more, as if the past months had been a fever dream. The revolt left no clear leader behind. It had been a collective act, not a coup, a city pressing back against a papacy that had stepped too far into the realm of performance. The participants returned to their homes, their daily labour, their marketplaces, carrying with them the knowledge that even in the 9th century, the people of Rome could dictate the terms of a pontificate's end. Yet beneath the restored surface, the Cadaver Synod lingered. It had not been forgotten, only contained. Its memory remained in the minds of those who had been in the basilica that day, in the murmured accounts of travellers, and in the uneasy glances toward the Tiber, where the body of Formosus had once defied its own burial. Stephen's fall had been swift, but the questions raised by his actions would not vanish with him. Rome, a city accustomed to spectacle, had seen something new, the public unmaking of a pope, and then the unmaking of the man who had ordered it. It was a sequence that suggested power here was both absolute and alarmingly fragile, its authority able to dissolve in a single season. In the closing days of summer 897, the lesson was clear enough. The papacy could survive many things, but not the unanimous ridicule of the city it ruled. The palace halls where Stephen had once walked were lit again by the same candles, the same oil lamps, casting shadows on the same frescoes. Yet their meaning had shifted. They no longer illuminated a ruler confident in his authority, but a stage recently cleared after the collapse of a performance. And the next act, as always in Rome, was already being prepared. The fall of Stephen VI left the papal throne not so much vacant as momentarily unclaimed. In Rome, a change in pontiff was never just a clerical matter. It was a shift in the city's gravitational centre. The absence of a ruling pope pulled at every faction, each sensing that the direction taken now would determine whether the Cadaver Synod remained a precedent or became an embarrassment to be erased. Into this unsettled atmosphere stepped Pope Romanus. His election was swift, the sort of decision made not to chart a new course, but to steady the ship in turbulent waters. Chroniclers offer few details of the conclave, suggesting that the choice was less about personality and more about function. Romanus's task was clear: to dismantle Stephen's rulings with the same speed that Stephen had imposed them. Romanus acted quickly. The decrees of the Cadaver Synod were declared void, the condemnation of Formosus overturned. It was a legal maneuver, but also a symbolic one, a signal that the papacy would no longer stand behind the spectacle that had just toppled its last occupant. In a city where politics often moved in measured increments, the reversal was startlingly abrupt. And then, almost as quickly as he appeared, Romanus was gone. Sources disagree on whether he was deposed, resigned, or simply died. The 9th century papacy was a revolving door through which even the most cautious pontiff might be ushered without warning. His tenure, measured in months, was long enough to erase Stephen's verdict, but too brief to establish anything resembling stability. The next man to wear the fisherman's ring was Theodore II. His pontificate would last only about 20 days, an interval so brief that the annals of Rome record little about his administration beyond one decisive act. Theodore ordered that the body of Formosus, recovered from its improvised grave, be reinterred in St. Peter's Basilica with full honours. The gesture was more than ceremonial. It restored to Formosus the dignity of papal burial and, by extension, to the office itself a semblance of continuity. The reburial was attended by clergy and citizens alike. In a city where memory was often as powerful as law, the sight of the former pope's remains carried through the streets would have spoken as loudly as any decree. The basilica, which had once served as the courtroom for his trial, now received him in quiet procession. No speeches survived from the day, but the act itself was its own statement. The dead pope had been brought home. Theodore's death, or possible removal, followed almost immediately after. As with Romanus, the record is silent on the mechanics, as if the brevity of his reign did not warrant further explanation. What mattered was that yet another pontificate had ended, and the chair of Peter was empty once more. In this period, papal succession was less the orderly passing of a torch and more the frantic keeping of a flame. The city, still unsettled by the events of the Cadaver Synod, cycled through leaders as if testing each for their ability to survive the atmosphere of suspicion and shifting loyalty. The results were not encouraging. These rapid changes underscored the fragility of the institution in the late 9th century. Each pope was expected to project authority, yet each was vulnerable to the same political currents that had unseated his predecessor. The palace could be a throne room one month and a prison cell the next. Even the restoration of Formosus's honour could not disguise the fact that the papacy was operating under conditions closer to crisis management than governance. The brief reigns of Romanus and Theodore II served as a kind of hinge between the violence of Stephen's tenure and the more systematic restoration that would follow. They demonstrated that reversal was possible, even if permanence was not. By the time the next pope ascended, the synod's rulings had been formally nullified, and the corpse at the centre of the controversy had been laid to rest for the second time. But the question remained whether the papacy could bury the event itself. Nullification and reburial could erase decrees and change processions, but they could not undo the memory of a pope on trial in his own basilica. The city had seen too much. The next pontiff would have to reckon not only with Formosus's ghost, but with the fact that the ghost had already been paraded before the world. In the 9th century papal court, survival depended as much on the management of perception as on the enactment of policy. Romanus and Theodore had restored certain formalities, but they had not yet restored confidence. That would require not just symbolic acts, but the deliberate rewriting of the narrative itself, a task that would fall to their successor. The election of John IX in the closing months of 898 was less a surprise than a settlement. His rise to the papal throne came in the aftermath of rapid turnovers, each shorter than the last, and his mandate was clear: to finish what Romanus and Theodore II had begun. If the Cadaver Synod had been an act of spectacle, John's papacy would be an exercise in quiet erasure. From the start, John moved deliberately. His first synods addressed not theology, but procedure, the legal skeleton of the Church's authority. The rulings of Stephen VI's Cadaver Synod were not merely annulled, they were condemned. In formal language, the trial was declared void from the outset, as if it had never happened. To the chroniclers, this was not rewriting history so much as restoring it to the correct version, though the need to make such a claim betrayed how indelibly the memory remained. One of John's most decisive acts was the burning of the Cadaver Synod's official records. The parchment that had recorded the charges, the testimonies, and the verdict was consigned to flames, an administrative form of burial. In theory, this eliminated the evidence of the proceedings. In practice, the destruction of the records became its own kind of evidence, a silent acknowledgement that the event had been both real and regrettable. John went further. He decreed that no future trials could be held against the dead, effectively placing a legal boundary around the papacy's reach. The prohibition was absolute, applying even to clergy accused of the most severe offences. In the phrasing of the time, the ban was less about protecting the dignity of the deceased than about maintaining the order of ecclesiastical law. A court could judge a man's life, but not relitigate it once death had closed the file. The formal excommunication of Stephen VI's surviving allies followed. These were not symbolic gestures. They were calculated moves to sever the chain of influence that had made the Cadaver Synod possible. Those named were cut off from the Church's sacraments, their participation in its governance permanently ended. The measures sent a message that the papacy intended to close ranks and control its own narrative, even if the city beyond its walls still traded in the story. For Rome, the reforms were as much about tone as about policy. The papacy's authority depended on the perception that it was steady, even when the politics beneath were shifting. John's rulings re-established the rhythms of normal governance, synods debating doctrine, processions marking feast days, clerics appointed and consecrated without reference to corpses in court. It was not that the Cadaver Synod was forgotten, but that it was increasingly treated as an aberration, a strange season in the life of the Church, bracketed and filed away. And yet, the memory persisted in quieter forms. Pilgrims to St. Peter's could still visit the tomb of Formosus, restored to its place among his predecessors. Clergy who had lived through the trial might avoid speaking of it, but the image of the dead pope, enthroned in the basilica, lingered in the private recollections of those who had seen it. History could be managed, but not erased. John IX's restoration was thorough enough to withstand immediate challenge. In the years that followed, no pope attempted to revisit the verdict of the Cadaver Synod, and the prohibition against posthumous trials remained in force. In the official registers, Stephen VI's rulings disappeared, and the sequence of papal succession resumed as if the synod had never interrupted it. The continuity was more carefully curated than organic, but in the politics of the 9th century papacy, presentation was often as important as reality. The burning of the records, intended to blot out the episode, ensured its survival in a different way. Absence invites speculation, and the very lack of documentation made the Cadaver Synod a subject for retelling, each account shaped by the teller's perspective. Over time, the story took on the quality of legend, improbable, almost theatrical, yet anchored in fact. For John, the final restoration was not about vindicating Formosus personally. It was about defending the institution from the instability that the synod had exposed. The papacy could not afford to appear as a stage for vendettas, especially when those vendettas reached into the grave. The reforms were a way of pulling the curtain closed, of ensuring that whatever had happened on that winter day in 897 would not happen again. By the end of his pontificate, the Cadaver Synod had been buried twice, once in the Tiber and once in the administrative record. The first burial failed. The second, though never complete, was enough to restore the appearance of unbroken tradition. In Rome, appearances could be as enduring as marble. What John Ime could not control was the afterlife of the story itself. In the centuries to come, the trial of a dead pope would surface in chronicles, sermons, and whispered anecdotes, each retelling proof that some spectacles resist the confines of official memory. In the 9th century, the papacy had sought to silence the event. In history, it became one of its most memorable chapters. In the end, the Cadaver Synod did not simply fade into the footnotes of 9th century Rome. It lingered, not in official decrees, which were burned, or in papal registers, which were rewritten, but in the stubborn memory of a city that had seen the unseeable. The trial had been meant to erase a man's papacy. Instead, it carved itself into history. Formosus was buried, reburied, and restored, each ceremony a kind of punctuation mark in a sentence that refused to end. Stephen VI, the Pope who had summoned the corpse to court, died behind bars before he could write the next chapter. His successors worked with the urgency of men patching a roof in the middle of a storm, nullifying rulings, reinterring bodies, and banning the very act that had brought them to this point. On the surface, the restoration succeeded. The papacy resumed its ceremonies. Basilicas filled again with the sound of liturgy rather than the murmur of scandal. Processions wound through the streets of Rome in their appointed seasons, incense drifting through the air as if nothing unusual had ever happened. But the city had learned something that no synod could erase, that the papal office, for all its grandeur and ritual, was not immune to the same currents of power, revenge, and opportunism that swirled through any other court. The Lateran could be both the stage for coronations and the stage for spectacle, sometimes within the same generation. The Cadaver Synod has often been told as an episode of medieval grotesquerie, a strange aside in the long story of the papacy. Yet its absurdity was matched only by its precision. Every gesture, from the throne where the corpse sat to the stripping of vestments, had been calibrated for political effect. It was not madness, it was method, wrapped in robes and ceremony. And therein lies its unsettling power. The trial was both theatrical and legally binding, both ridiculous and consequential. It reminds us that history's most enduring images are often the ones that should never have been possible. A court convened to judge the dead. A basilica turned into a witness stand. A river bearing away the remains of a pope. In death, Formosus became more visible than he had ever been in life. His trial and posthumous rehabilitation gave him a kind of narrative arc that few living rivals achieved. He was condemned, discarded, retrieved, honored, and ultimately enshrined. A full cycle of disgrace and redemption played out entirely without his participation. The irony is that the synod achieved the opposite of its intent. Instead of erasing Formosus's papacy, it ensured that his name would be remembered long after the factional disputes of his time had been forgotten. The petty grievances that fueled the trial dissolved with the decades. The image of the corpse on trial did not. 9 centuries later, chroniclers still wrote of it. Modern historians, too, return to it, not just for the morbid curiosity it inspires, but for the clarity with which it reveals the machinery of power. The Cadaver Synod was, in its way, a perfect distillation of the era. Politics, dressed in liturgy, law, performed as theatre, authority asserting itself even where no voice could answer back. And so it ends, not with poetic justice, nor with tidy resolution, but with a kind of haunted equilibrium. The papacy continued, Rome endured, and Formosus lay in his tomb once more, restored in title, if not in peace. The spectacle was over, but its echo remained, like the sound of a gavel in an empty hall.